A routine traffic stop turns into a nightmare when racist cops pull over a black Secret Service agent. They thought they could control the situation until it spirals out of their hands in the most shocking way. What happens next will leave you questioning everything about justice and accountability. Watch the full story unfold, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening stories like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss out. Jessica gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, still fuming from the argument she'd had at work. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, but things quickly spiraled. A colleague, someone she once respected, had the audacity to question her judgment. "You're being too emotional, Jessica," he said, with that dismissive tone she knew all too well. Emotional? She was furious. Here she was, a seasoned Secret Service agent with years of experience, being told her decisions were based on feelings rather than facts. All because she valued protecting lives over following red tape. It wasn't just a disagreement about protocol, it was an attack on her credibility. And, deep down, she knew that if she wasn't a black woman in a space dominated by white men, her professionalism would never have been questioned like that. With her mind still racing, Jessica took a deep breath as she pulled out of the agency's parking lot. The tension from work was bad enough, but she knew heading home wouldn't be much better. Her neighborhood had never really felt like home. Sure, it was mostly quiet, and the lawns were well kept, but beneath that surface was an undercurrent of judgment. Eyes always followed her, not out of admiration, but suspicion. No matter what she had accomplished in her career, here she was just another black face in a white neighborhood, and that was enough to make people uncomfortable. As she drove, the weight of the day settled heavier on her chest. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with these silent judgments, but tonight, it felt different. Maybe it was the argument at work, maybe it was the rising tension in the neighborhood, or maybe it was just exhaustion from constantly having to prove herself, both as an agent and as a black woman. Either way, she had a sinking feeling that this night wasn't going to end well. It wasn't long before Jessica noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank. She wasn't speeding, and everything about her car was in order. But she knew the drill. It didn't matter. As the officers approached, she could feel the tension rising. Officer Rick Davis led the way, his posture rigid, eyes hard with judgment. He didn't see Jessica Moore, Secret Service agent. He saw a black woman in a nice car, and that was enough to ignite his suspicion. "License and registration," he barked, the words cutting through the night air like a blade. Jessica didn't need to be told twice. She had been through this routine before. But there was something about Davis. His hostility was palpable, as if he was itching for confrontation. Beside him stood Officer Matt Scott, younger, more uncertain. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting from Jessica to his partner. You could see the conflict in his expression. He wasn't like Davis. He didn't have the same toxic bravado, but he lacked the courage to speak up. Jessica could sense it. As she handed over her credentials, there was a flicker of hope that Scott might step in, might remind Davis that she was one of them. "Secret Service," she said calmly, flashing her badge. But Davis didn't care. His prejudice was already driving the narrative in his mind. "Right," he scoffed, leaning closer. "And I'm the president." Scott winced at his partner's words, but still said nothing. Jessica watched him, her eyes pleading for a hint of humanity, but Scott's silence only deepened her frustration. He might not have been as openly hostile as Davis, but his inaction made him just as complicit. And as the tension built, Jessica knew this wasn't going to end with a simple traffic stop. The tension snapped when Davis found out Jessica had a firearm in the vehicle. It wasn't illegal, far from it. As a federal agent, she had every right to carry it. But to Davis, this was the perfect excuse to escalate the situation. Without warning, he grabbed Jessica and forcefully shoved her against her car, her face pressing into the cold metal. "Hands on the car!" he barked, his voice dripping with a sick pleasure, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She could feel his hands roughly patting her down, running along her body in a way that wasn't just about searching for a weapon, it was about asserting control, violating her space. And she knew this procedure. This was supposed to be done by a female officer. But Davis didn't care about protocol, didn't care about her rights. He was treating her like a criminal, like she was less than human. Scott, standing a few feet away, watched in stunned silence. His heart pounded in his chest, torn between doing what he knew was right and the fear of standing up to his partner. He could see the injustice playing out before him, and every second that passed without him stepping in felt like another betrayal. This isn't right, he thought, the words echoing in his mind, but somehow stuck in his throat. He had always known Davis had a dark side, but seeing it like this, so blatant, so cruel, made him question everything. How many times had he turned a blind eye before? How many times had he let Davis walk all over people just to keep the peace between them? The pressure built inside Scott, a heavy weight pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak, his voice shaky as the first words stumbled out. "Rick, maybe we should—" But before he could even finish, Davis spun around, his face twisted with rage. "Shut your damn mouth, Scott!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the night air. "You better learn how to deal with people like this." His tone was laced with venom, the disdain in his words making it clear who he thought Jessica was. Nothing more than an obstacle, something to be controlled. "This is how you handle trash like her." Scott recoiled, the force of Davis's words hitting him harder than he expected. He swallowed the rest of his sentence, fear tightening around his throat like a vice. In that moment, Scott wasn't just a witness, he was a part of it, a silent accomplice to Davis's abuse of power. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he had the strength to stop it. Jessica felt utterly violated. The roughness of Davis's hands during the pat-down, something that should never have happened without a female officer, had left her feeling exposed, humiliated. As if being shoved against her own car wasn't enough. The crude way Davis spoke to her, his words dripping with condescension and racism, made her feel smaller with each passing second. "People like you never learn, do you?" he spat, his voice full of contempt. She could feel her strength crumbling under the weight of the situation. Despite all her training, all the control she'd mastered as a Secret Service agent, tears began to well up in her eyes. She fought them back at first, but soon they flowed freely. The injustice, the violation, the humiliation. It was too much. Davis, instead of showing any hint of remorse or recognizing her pain, only seemed to grow more satisfied. Her tears fed his ego, his twisted sense of control. "Oh, now you want to cry? Think that's gonna help you?" he mocked, his grin widening as if he had won some sick game. Her tears, a release of the deep hurt she was feeling, only made him feel more powerful. He leaned closer, lowering his voice but making sure it dripped with scorn. "I told you, you're not special. Not here, not to me." The cruelty in his words was unbearable, and it was clear that for him, this wasn't about law or order. It was about breaking her spirit. Meanwhile, the people in the neighborhood, who had initially been entertained by the sight of a black woman being pulled over, had been filming the incident on their phones. At first, they seemed to enjoy the spectacle, some even muttering comments about finally catching the trouble in the neighborhood. But as Davis's actions grew more aggressive and Jessica's tears more visible, the mood shifted. The excessive force, the sneering tone, and the way Davis seemed to take pleasure in her humiliation. It was becoming too much, even for them. Whispers began to spread through the small crowd. "He's going too far," one person murmured, their phones still recording. Another looked on with a mix of concern and guilt, starting to recognize that this wasn't justice. It was abuse. As the crowd watched, the truth of what was happening became impossible to ignore. Davis wasn't just conducting a routine stop. He was using his badge as a weapon, targeting Jessica because of her race. The drugs he planted, the way he manhandled her, the cruel words. It all painted a picture of a man driven by racism and a need to dominate. Jessica, a respected federal agent, had been reduced to nothing in his eyes simply because of the color of her skin. Every moment he spent degrading her was a reminder of the deep-seated prejudices that people like him carried under their uniform. Jessica's tears had dried, replaced by a silent fury. She stood there, still pinned against her car, but no longer just the victim of Davis's brutality. Her mind was racing now, not just about this night, but about every time she, or someone like her, had been treated this way. The abuse of power was clear, and it wasn't just about Davis. He was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that had been embedded in the very system that was supposed to protect people like her. She wasn't powerless, not really, but Davis had used every trick in the book to make her feel that way. And Scott? His silence only added to the weight of the injustice. Scott's internal struggle was boiling over. He could no longer stand there, watching, knowing that every second he stayed silent, he was endorsing Davis's actions. But the fear of stepping in was paralyzing. Davis had made it clear who was in charge, who had the power. The younger officer's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen if he intervened. Would his career be over? Would he become an outcast within the department? He knew he couldn't let Davis continue, but the words just wouldn't come. His silence wasn't just complicity, it was betrayal, not only to Jessica, but to the ideals he had once sworn to uphold. The tense silence was shattered by the ringing of Jessica's phone. Davis had nearly confiscated it earlier, but now that call would change everything. Jessica's superior, a high-ranking federal officer, was on the line, demanding to speak with her. The shift in Davis's demeanor was immediate, though not entirely in the way you might expect. Instead of backing down, he hesitated, the smugness on his face faltering for the first time. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice sharper now, as if trying to regain control. But the situation was slipping through his fingers. Jessica, despite everything, answered with the same composure she had when the night began. "It's my superior. They're sending agents." Within minutes, unmarked cars arrived at the scene, and federal agents stepped out, their presence changing the dynamic completely. Davis's once dominant stance shrank in their shadow, though his expression was still defiant. Scott, however, seemed frozen in place, his face pale as the realization hit him. This was about to unravel, and fast. One of the agents walked directly toward Davis, demanding an explanation. "What's going on here?" The tension in the air was thick, and Davis, grasping at straws, tried to assert his authority. "Routine stop, she was—" But the agent wasn't having it. "She's with us," he said, cutting Davis off with a cold finality. As Jessica stood there, still reeling from the humiliation of being searched and manhandled, she watched the federal agent step up to Davis, his face hard with cold fury. "You think this is how we operate?" the agent snapped, his voice low but cutting through the night like a blade. Davis, trying to hold on to his crumbling authority, squared his shoulders. "I was doing my job," he muttered, but the federal agent wasn't having it. "Your job?" The agent scoffed, stepping closer, towering over Davis. "Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and humiliate. But I guess men like you wouldn't understand that." Davis's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, the agent cut him off again. "Planting drugs? Shoving a federal agent against her own car? Violating her rights, and then thinking you'd get away with it?" His words were sharp, and the onlookers were silent now, eyes wide as the scene unfolded. "You're a disgrace to the badge," the agent continued, his tone colder. "Men like you are the reason people don't trust the police anymore." Davis stood there, speechless, his confidence utterly shattered under the weight of the agent's words. Jessica could see the defeat in his eyes, and for the first time that night, she felt some justice being served. Without waiting for Davis to reply, the agent reached out his hand, his voice stern and commanding. "Your weapon, now!" Davis hesitated, but the agent's glare left no room for defiance. With shaking hands, Davis unbuckled his holster and handed over the gun. "And your badge," the agent added, his tone laced with finality. "You won't be needing that anymore." Davis handed it over, his face a mix of rage and humiliation. The agent turned to Scott next, who had been watching in silent dread. "You too," he said, not missing a beat. "Weapon and badge. Now." Scott, trembling, followed suit, the weight of his inaction sinking in as he handed over his authority. The agent pocketed both officers' badges and weapons, his face set in grim satisfaction. "You're done." The situation had escalated quickly once the federal agents reviewed the body cam footage and the multiple cell phone videos captured by witnesses. Davis's abuse of power was laid bare, and there was no room for denial. Every angle confirmed the same story. Jessica had been framed and harassed, all because of Davis's unchecked authority. The agents acted swiftly, their voices cold and decisive as they arrested Davis on the spot. "You're under arrest," one agent stated, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. The smug look that Davis had worn all night disappeared, replaced by disbelief and rage as his career and reputation unraveled in front of him. But the federal agents didn't stop there. Scott, who had remained passive throughout the entire ordeal, was about to face his own reckoning. "You think standing by makes you innocent?" the lead agent asked, his gaze piercing. Scott's face turned pale as the words hit him. He had been silent when he should have spoken up, and now that silence was damning. "You're complicit in this," the agent continued, stepping toward him. "You had the chance to stop it, and you chose to do nothing." Scott's hands shook as another set of handcuffs was placed around his wrists. His fear of Davis had cost him everything, and now he would face the same punishment. Both officers, once powerful, were now disgraced, led away in silence, their weapons and badges taken. The situation didn't end with the arrests of Davis and Scott. Their superior officer arrived on the scene, hoping to smooth things over, but the federal agents had other plans. The lead agent confronted the superior with an intensity that silenced any attempt at excuses. "This is what passes for leadership in your precinct?" he asked, his voice filled with contempt. The superior officer stammered, "We didn't know," but the agent cut him off sharply. "That's your job, to know. Davis didn't get this way overnight, and you let it slide." The superior's face flushed as the agent continued, "This isn't just on him. It's on you, too. There will be a federal investigation, and you better be ready for it." The commanding officer stood there, humiliated, unable to respond. The federal agent delivered his final warning with icy precision. "Clean up your department, or we'll do it for you." The weight of those words hung in the air as the superior officer realized the full extent of the disaster he was now part of. It wasn't just Davis and Scott who would pay the price. The entire precinct was under scrutiny now, and no one was safe from the fallout. The federal agents had turned the tables, and justice was finally being served, not just for Jessica, but for every person who had suffered at the hands of officers like Davis. As the night wound down, Jessica stood by, no longer the victim of the situation, but the victor. The same neighbors who had once watched her with suspicion, eager to see her brought down, now looked at her with something different: respect. The videos that had captured the night's events circulated quickly, and the truth of what had happened became impossible to ignore. The narrative shifted. Jessica, once seen as an outsider in the neighborhood, was now recognized for who she really was: a federal agent who had stood her ground against systemic racism and abuse of power. The whispers that had once followed her now gave way to nods of acknowledgement when she walked by. After the incident, Jessica found that her presence in the neighborhood had changed. People who had once avoided her now greeted her with respect. She no longer felt the eyes of suspicion tracking her every move, no longer heard the hushed tones of judgment. The neighborhood had seen her strength, her dignity, and the way she handled herself in the face of injustice. It wasn't just about being a Secret Service agent anymore, it was about the person she had proven herself to be. Where there had been doubt, there was now a new sense of recognition and acceptance. For Jessica, this wasn't just personal redemption, it was a victory in a much larger fight. She had exposed a broken system and had stood against the very officers meant to protect and serve. But her journey wasn't over. This battle had been won, but the war against racial profiling and abuse of power was ongoing. And Jessica, now more determined than ever, knew that she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged. The respect she had earned wasn't just in her neighborhood, it was a symbol of a much greater mission to bring about change. Moral of the story. The moral of the story is that courage and resilience in the face of injustice can lead to change. Standing up against abuse of power and discrimination, even when it seems daunting or futile, helps expose the truth and brings accountability. It reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity, but speaking out can turn the tide toward justice, creating respect and inspiring transformation. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content that tackles real issues and inspires change, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Together, we can amplify these important stories and continue the fight for justice.